I have about 10 minutes to give an overview in context for the Battle of New Orleans, a tall order. You know, I first learned about the Battle of New Orleans about 30 years ago as a young man working on board the Creole Queen, which takes daily cruises down to the Chalmette National Battlefield. And during that time, I conceived a lifelong aversion to the popular 1959 song, The Battle of New Orleans, which I'm sure many of you know. It's a perfectly fine folk song written by Jimmy Driftwood, but when you have to hear it 20 times a day, every day, it wears a little thin. But anyway, the Battle of New Orleans, for those of you who don't know, was one of the culminating engagements of the War of 1812, which is often erroneously referred to as the second war of American independence. But it was in fact a byproduct of the larger Napoleonic wars fought between Britain and France and their respective allies from 1803 to 1815. This was a truly global conflict that engulfed not only Europe, but also North Africa, the Middle East, the Indian Ocean, and parts of America. Britain did not want war with the US or to retake American territory. They were far more concerned with the existential threat of Bonaparte's army and navy. The seizures of American cargoes and impressment of American seamen that led in part to the American declaration of war in June of 1812 were incidental to British efforts to isolate Napoleonic France through extensive naval blockades and restrictions on neutral trade. For the first couple of years after war was declared, the best that the British could do was to defend their valuable Canadian provinces against the incursions of the Americans, who had already announced their intent to annex Canada as part of the United States. And it's not until after their success at the Battle of Toulouse and the first abdication of Napoleon that the British military establishment is finally able to turn their attention to the so-called American War. The Royal Navy in North America was finally joined by veteran British regiments who in the summer of 1814 marched into Washington, D.C., occupied our capital, and burned most of the public buildings there, including the White House. That British offensive soon stalled outside of Baltimore. The expeditionary force withdrew from the Chesapeake, bound for a new objective in the hope of bringing the American War to a quick and advantageous conclusion. The idea of attacking New Orleans had been suggested as early as August of 1812 by John Borlase-Warren. He was the commander-in-chief of the Royal Navy in North America. And he suggested it as a way of drawing American resources away from the vulnerable Canadian frontier. New Orleans was economically vital for the well-being of the United States, especially the communities in the Trans-Appalachian West, which relied on the port of New Orleans to make their farms, their fur stocks, their mines economically feasible. New Orleans was known to be geographically remote from the rest of the United States, and military planners in London thought that the cultural differences between Francophone and Spanish-speaking Louisianans could be used to drive a wedge between them and the English-speaking Anglo-Americans of the rest of the United States. On August 10th, 1814, the British government issued the official approval to proceed with the invasion, and by early September, a large force begins to assemble in Jamaica. Meanwhile, the defense of New Orleans was entrusted to a newly minted Major General, formerly of the Tennessee Militia. Andrew Jackson was 47 years old at this time. He was an unknown quantity to the British Army. He had no formal training as a military officer. He had worked in the frontier settlements of Tennessee as a lawyer, a circuit judge, and a politician. What he may have lacked in the formal theory of warfare, he made up for in determination and unusually sound instincts. His strategy of carrying the war to the enemy and beating him on his own ground had brought the Creek War to a successful conclusion the previous year, the previous March, and it earned Jackson a regular U.S. infantry commission as a major general, plus the responsibility of defending the southwestern quadrant of the United States, which included the Mississippi Territory and Louisiana, including New Orleans. General Jackson and his men arrived on a cold and rainy December morning at Fort St. John, just outside of New Orleans. He was dismayed in the days that followed to find a poorly defended city that was beleaguered by social and political dissent. But he immediately went to work personally surveying the terrain and ordering improvements to defensive works. Locals were ordered to obstruct all the creeks and bayous leading to the city, anything that might aid the British approach. Jackson also reviewed both his regular U.S. troops and the Louisiana militia. He didn't have a lot of regular troops, only about 1,100 men and some sailors. But fortunately, Jackson's professional soldiers would be bolstered by militia and volunteers from Louisiana, Mississippi, Tennessee, and eventually Kentucky. As state militias and volunteers poured into the city in December, Jackson approved the raising and equipping of additional units, including a force of Choctaw Indians, Baratarian pirates, and 2 armed battalions of free colored men, the second of which were emigres from Saint-Domingue, or what we would call Haiti today. The advanced ships from the British fleet arrived off the Louisiana coast at around the same time that Jackson and his men did, and British naval and army commanders began planning their approach to the city, while their subordinates worked out a plan for the American gunboats sighted in Lake Borgne. Now, the main fleet couldn't approach our coast any closer than Ship and Cat Islands. The inland lakes and waterways were too shallow for their deep draft warships. The Mississippi River had a big bar that prevented anything larger than a brig or a sloop from entering the river. On December 12th, a force of 45 launches and barges left the British fleet, which were anchored off Ship and Cat Islands. They were manned by 1,000 British seamen and volunteers under the command of Captain Nicholas Lockyer of the Royal Navy. A day and a half later, they caught and engaged the 5 American gunboats near the Rigolets and captured all 5 gunboats and their crews after a fierce battle, a very high rate of casualties. They captured all 5 American gunboats as well as their tender, the sloop Alligator, and now the way was open for British troop transports across Lake Borgne. When the news of the outcome of the Battle of Lake Borgne reached New Orleans, panic gripped the city. Jackson dispersed his available force to cover all the various approaches to New Orleans, ensuring good communication so that his men could quickly be concentrated at any point of attack. But he appears to have kept his numerical strength a secret, even from his own junior officers. General Jackson was beginning to have his doubts about the loyalties of Louisianans and New Orleans. And those doubts, along with the panic in the city after Lake Borgne, led him to declare martial law in the city, although he had no legal authority to do so. A strict curfew was implemented and small arms were requisitioned from households all over the city. I don't have time today to recount the series of engagements that make up the Battle of New Orleans, and I think Tony Fernandez is going to talk at length about the British landing on December 23rd and the initial scouting. But I will say that Jackson's decision to immediately attack the British after hearing of their landing that very night was critical to his overall victory. It made the invaders hesitate, threw off their timetable, and it gave the Americans valuable time to fall back to a fortified defensive position farther upriver. Later, Jackson wisely kept his men behind his fortified line rather than sending untrained militia and volunteers out into an open field with seasoned British regulars who were very skilled in the use of muskets and bayonets after years of fighting Napoleonic troops in the Peninsular Wars. This showed judgment and patience on Jackson's part, even though he's often accused of being rash and impulsive. When we mention the Battle of New Orleans, we're usually talking about the final and decisive engagement that took place on the morning of January 8th, 1815. But in fact, there were a number of land battles that took place between American and British forces over a 2-week period in late December and early January. These were brought about by British efforts to probe and hopefully penetrate American defenses. Andrew Jackson and his men were dug in behind a water-filled ditch and an earthen rampart. about 1,000 yards long and supported by superior artillery, so 8 batteries made up of various cannons along its entire length. They had a very strong defensive position. They were well supplied from the city, and they could afford to wait for the British to come to them. Isn't to say that Jackson didn't have his challenges. One of the most significant was the inability of Jackson and some of his officers to converse directly with French-speaking Louisiana militia troops. While the British had the larger and more professional force, they had some very significant disadvantages. Most of all, their mobility was restricted by the topography of South Louisiana, coastal Louisiana. They had no choice but to advance along the high ground between the Mississippi River and the cypress swamps on the natural alluvial high ground, where there was no cover from American guns. Their field artillery was still at sea, and they couldn't capture enough horses to mount their cavalry. Thus, with no way to hammer American defenses from afar or to strike them quickly with mounted horsemen, they were restricted mostly to a slow infantry assault, foot soldiers, with slight support from a few naval cannons brought up by Royal Navy sailors from the fleet. They had to be literally drugged through the swamps and put in improvised batteries. Furthermore, all of the British Army's supplies and ammunition had to be carried 80 miles from the fleet anchorage point through the swamps and up to the front line where they were needed. In the end, the British invaders could not prevail, and their last-ditch effort to storm Jackson's line on January 8th ended with staggering casualties, including the deaths of 2 major generals and the near annihilation of at least 1 regiment. By contrast, the Americans suffered about 75 casualties, including 13 men killed. It was then and remains to this day one of the most lopsided victories in all of military history. The immediate tactical importance of the battle's outcome was the preservation of the port of New Orleans for America. It was one of the United States' most valuable and vulnerable ports. But psychologically, it was an astounding victory that came at the end of a long and unpopular war, during which the U.S. had experienced many humiliating defeats, not least the burning of our capital, Washington. To conclude, let me address the common misconception that the Battle of New Orleans was fought after the War of 1812 had ended. This is a common claim. It is true that the peace treaty was signed by American and British commissioners at Ghent on Christmas Eve in 1814, a day after British troops landed in Louisiana. However, no treaty can end a war in and of itself. That's only the first step. The signed copies of the treaty have to be sent back to the governments of those signatories to be debated and approved or ratified. In the case of the Treaty of Ghent, British commissioners stipulated that hostilities would continue until the ratified treaties were formally exchanged. Thus, the War of 1812, and of course this took a good bit of time in the Age of Sail. The War of 1812, therefore, doesn't officially end until a representative of the Prince Regent exchanged ratifications with President Madison at Washington on February 16, 1815, more than a month after Jackson's famous victory at New Orleans. Thank you very much.